My wife sat across from me at our kitchen table, sliding a thick manila envelope across the polished wood. She did not look sad. She did not look angry. Her face was completely blank, the way someone looks when they are returning a pair of shoes that do not fit anymore. She told me she was filing for divorce, that she was taking our 7-year-old daughter, Lily, and that she had already filed a restraining order based on a manufactured domestic abuse claim. Before I could even process the words, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was an automated email from my company's HR department. My position as Senior Logistics Director was terminated, effective immediately, due to a sudden investigation into corporate embezzlement. I looked up at the woman I had loved for 12 years, completely paralyzed. In a span of 60 seconds, my marriage, my child, my career, and my reputation were erased. I did not even have the chance to scream. 2 police officers stepped out from our hallway, where they had been waiting the entire time. They grabbed my arms, forced my hands behind my back, and marched me out of my own house in front of all my neighbors. As they pushed my head down into the back of the cruiser, I caught a glimpse of my brother, David, standing near the edge of our driveway. He was holding my wife's hand. He gave me a small, triumphant nod. My own brother had engineered my destruction, and I was going to prison for crimes I never committed. The next 3 years were a blur of concrete walls, broken teeth, and legal silence. My lawyer, a cheap public defender who clearly did not care, told me that the paper trail against me was airtight. Millions of dollars had been funneled from my department into an offshore account registered in my name. David had set it up perfectly. He was always the golden child, the one our parents bailed out of debt, the one who could do no wrong. I was just the reliable worker bee, who paid his taxes and built a quiet life. By the time I was released on a technicality regarding evidence mishandling, I had nothing left. My parents had passed away while I was inside, leaving everything to David. Lily had been legally adopted by him after my parental rights were stripped. I walked down the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, wearing a threadbare coat from a donation bin. I just wanted to see my daughter one last time from a distance. I walked to the park near my old house, hiding behind a row of oak trees. I saw her. Lily was 10 now, riding her bicycle, laughing. David was sitting on a bench nearby, watching her. He noticed me shifting through the branches. He did not run. He did not call the police. He just walked over to me, smiling that same arrogant smile. He whispered that I was a ghost, that no one believed a convicted felon, and that if I ever came near his family again, he would make sure I went back to a cell permanently. Then he shoved me backward, hard. My heel caught the edge of the curb. I tripped, falling backward into the path of a speeding city bus. There was a deafening screech of air brakes, a violent impact that shattered my ribs, and then a cold, crushing darkness. My last thought was not about survival. It was pure, unadulterated hatred for the people who had stolen my life. Then, I blinked. The roar of the city bus was gone. The smell of exhaust and wet pavement disappeared. Instead, the sharp, artificial scent of cheap lemon cleaner filled my nose. I was sitting at a cluttered desk, staring at a massive stack of printed shipping manifests. A heavy, old-school CRT monitor flickered in front of me. I looked down at my hands. They were smooth, unscarred, and completely free of prison calluses. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an old iPhone model that had been out of production for a decade. The date on the lock screen read the 14th of October 2016. I sat frozen for nearly 5 minutes, my heart hammering against my chest. I checked my reflection in the dark screen of the monitor. I looked younger. The deep lines of stress and grief around my eyes were gone. I was back at my old job at Midwest Logistics. Exactly 8 years before my life ended. It was the morning of my 32nd birthday. I was not dead. I was not in prison. I had been sent back to the exact year before the embezzlement scheme even started. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop shaking. I realized that this was not a dream, and it was not a hallucination. It was a clean slate. But more importantly, it was a weapon. I knew every financial crisis that was coming, every corporate merger, and every single move my brother and my wife were about to make. I swore to myself right then that I would not play the victim this time. I opened my personal email and looked at my calendar. That evening, my wife had planned a surprise birthday dinner at our favorite steakhouse. In my past life, I had wept with gratitude. This time, I knew exactly what that dinner really was. It was the night she was going to introduce my brother to our corporate circle as a new consultant. I left work early and drove straight to our suburban home. The key fit perfectly in the lock. Walking inside felt like stepping into a museum of my own failures. I went straight to the basement, to the old metal filing cabinet where we kept our tax documents. I needed to see if the groundwork for my downfall had already been laid. As I searched through the folders, I found a hidden compartment behind the drawer track. Inside was a secondary passport for my wife, along with a bank statement from a Swiss institution I had never heard of. The account already had $50,000 in it. My stomach churned. The betrayal had started far earlier than I ever realized. They had been planning this for years, spinning a web around me while I was busy working 60-hour weeks to pay off our mortgage. I took out my phone and took clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. Just as I finished hiding the files back where I found them, I heard the front door open upstairs. It was my wife. She called out my name in that sweet, affectionate tone that used to make me feel so safe. I walked up the stairs, forcing a smile onto my face, feeling like an actor stepping onto a stage. She ran into my arms, kissing my cheek and wishing me a happy birthday. She looked so innocent, so completely incapable of malice. She told me she had a special surprise for me at dinner, and that she had invited David because he had some incredible business ideas that could help my career. I nodded, thanking her, pretending to be the naive, trusting husband she thought I was. But as I held her, I looked past her shoulder at the living room mirror. I realized that my brother was already living in our house in spirit, pulling the strings. We arrived at the restaurant an hour later. David was already sitting at the corner booth, sipping an expensive scotch. He stood up, giving me a massive bear hug, clapping me on the back. He told me he was proud of me, that my hard work at the company was finally paying off, and that he wanted to help me expand my department's reach. He introduced a friend of his who had joined him, a man named Marcus who ran an independent software firm. In my previous life, I had eagerly accepted Marcus's pitch to integrate a new inventory tracking system into my logistics network. That software was the exact backdoor David had used to frame me for embezzlement. Marcus slid a contract across the table, explaining that it was just a preliminary agreement for a free trial of their system. He told me it was completely risk-free. My wife smiled, nudging my elbow, telling me that I should trust David's judgment. I looked at the contract. I knew that signing this meant giving them the keys to my professional execution. I picked up the pen, feeling everyone's eyes on me. I looked at David, seeing the faint, predatory gleam in his eyes that I had been too blind to notice the first time around. Instead of signing, I dropped the pen and leaned back in my booth. I told them that our company policy had recently changed, and that all external software vendors had to go through a formal compliance audit by our legal team first. David's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to downplay the necessity of an audit, saying it would take too long. I laughed it off, saying I didn't want to get fired on my birthday for breaking corporate rules. They quickly changed the subject, but the tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. When we got home that night, my wife was unusually quiet. She asked me why I had been so difficult about the contract, accusing me of not supporting my brother's ambitions. She looked frustrated, a tiny crack forming in her perfect facade. I told her I was just tired, that work had been stressful, and that I would look at it again next week. She turned her back to me in bed, thinking she was punishing me with silence. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I realized that by refusing to sign that contract, I had completely derailed their original timeline. They were going to have to adapt, which meant they were going to make a mistake. The next morning at the office, I didn't waste a single moment. I called the head of corporate security, a retired federal agent named Vance who had always been strict but fair. In my past life, I had avoided him. This time, I walked right into his office and closed the door. I told him that I had noticed some strange anomalies in our digital shipping logs, and that I suspected someone was trying to test our firewall from an external IP address. I didn't mention my brother or my wife. I just gave him the IP address associated with Marcus's software company, which I had memorized from my prison trial documents. Vance sharpened his gaze, leaning forward over his desk. He thanked me for the heads up and told me he would look into it quietly without alerting the IT staff. I left his office feeling a surge of adrenaline. The trap was set, but I knew I couldn't just defend myself. I had to go on the offensive. I needed capital. I needed money that didn't go through our joint marital accounts. Money that my wife could never touch or discover during a divorce proceeding. I remembered that in December of 2016, a small biotech company based in Chicago was going to announce a massive breakthrough in cancer treatment, causing their penny stock to skyrocket by over 4,000% in a single day. I gathered all my personal savings from an old account my parents had set up for me before they died. An account my wife didn't even know existed. It was only $12,000, but it was all I had. I put every single penny into that biotech stock. It was a massive gamble, but I knew the future. 3 weeks passed. My wife became increasingly distant, often staying out late under the guise of helping her sister plan a wedding. I knew better. I hired a private investigator using a burner phone and cash. Within 4 days, the investigator sent a encrypted file to my private email. It contained dozens of photos of my wife and my brother entering a boutique hotel downtown during his lunch breaks. Seeing the images didn't break my heart this time. It reinforced my resolve. They weren't just trying to ruin my career. They were laughing at me behind my back while destroying my future. On the first Monday of December, I woke up and turned on the financial news channel while making coffee. The anchor announced that the biotech firm had just received FDA approval for their landmark therapy. By noon, my $12,000 investment was worth nearly $500,000. I immediately liquidated the shares, moving the funds into a newly formed corporate entity under a shell name based in Delaware. I was no longer a defenseless corporate drone. I had a war chest. That afternoon, David called me. His voice sounded frantic, stripped of his usual smug confidence. He told me he was in a massive financial bind with some bad real estate investments and needed a short-term loan of $50,000. He begged me not to tell our parents or my wife. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to create a paper trail of undocumented cash transfers between us to justify the embezzlement charge later. I told him I didn't have that kind of liquidity in my personal accounts. Then, I paused, letting the silence hang over the line. I told him that while I couldn't lend him the cash directly, I knew a guy in the logistics department who handled our off-book freight accounts, someone who could easily route some company funds through an external vendor for a short period without anyone noticing. I could hear David's breath hitch over the phone. He swallowed hard, asking me if that was safe. I assured him it was entirely foolproof, and that I would set up the digital portal for him by the end of the week. I hung up the phone and smiled. I hadn't just avoided his trap. I had built a better one, and he was walking right into it. I spent the next 2 days creating a ghost vendor account within our company's system, but I didn't use my credentials. I used the administrative login of the executive VP, who had ultimately fired me in my past life. A man who had been secretly complicit in David's scheme but had escaped prosecution. I linked the payout routing directly to the Swiss bank account my wife had hidden in the basement. I was tying them all together in a single, neat knot. On Friday night, I went home early. My wife was in the kitchen, cooking a lavish dinner. She seemed unusually attentive, pouring me a glass of wine and asking how my day was. She told me that she had been thinking about our future, and that she wanted us to buy a larger house in a more exclusive neighborhood. She suggested we take out a second mortgage on our current home to pay for the down payment. I looked at her, realizing she was trying to drain every ounce of equity I had left. Before she dropped the divorce papers, I took a sip of the wine, nodding along with her plans. I told her it sounded like a wonderful idea, and that I would bring home the paperwork from the bank on Monday. She beamed, kissing me with a passion that felt entirely hollow. While she was cleaning up the kitchen, her phone vibrated on the counter. She had left it unlocked. I glanced down. It was a text message from David. It read, "The portal worked. The first transfer is pending. He has no idea." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. They thought they were winning. They thought I was the same stupid, blind idiot I had been 8 years ago. They had no clue that the trap they thought they were springing on me was actually closing around their own necks. The next morning, I received an encrypted text from Vance, the security chief. He asked me to come down to his office immediately on Monday morning before the general staff arrived. He said it was an emergency. I knew exactly what he had found. My plan was working perfectly, but as I sat in my living room watching my daughter Lily play with her dolls on the carpet, a sudden wave of panic washed over me. In my past life, the divorce had happened exactly 6 months from now. If I accelerated the timeline too fast, I risked losing custody of her in the chaos. I had to ensure that, when the hammer dropped, she was legally and completely protected from both of them. I called an elite family law attorney downtown, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. I paid him a $10,000 retainer out of my Delaware shell company. I laid out the private investigator's photos of the affair, the evidence of the hidden Swiss bank account, and the data logs showing my brother's financial manipulation. The attorney looked over the files, a grim smile appearing on his face. He told me that in the state of Illinois, this was more than enough to completely destroy her alimony claims and secure temporary full custody. But we needed one final, definitive blow to ensure she never got unsupervised visitation. I went to work on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Vance was waiting for me in his office, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He shut the door and turned his computer screen toward me. He showed me the digital trail. Someone had authorized a $300,000 transfer from our corporate accounts to a Swiss bank. The authorization code used belonged to the executive VP, but the external IP address that triggered the transfer belonged to my brother's residential Wi-Fi network. Vance told me he was going to call the FBI's white-collar crime division within the hour. He looked at me with deep sympathy, saying he knew David was my brother, and he wanted to warn me before the federal agents descended on the building. I put my head in my hands, pretending to be utterly devastated. I thanked him for his loyalty, and told him to do what he had to do. As soon as I walked out of his office, I called David. I forced my voice to sound terrified, breathless, and broken. I told him that corporate security had detected the transfer, that the FBI was being called, and that they knew the IP address came from his house. I told him he needed to clean out his files immediately, and leave town before they arrived. David panicked, screaming through the phone, asking me what he should do. I told him to go to my house, that my wife had a master key to his files, and that they should pack everything into her car and meet me at a diner on the outskirts of the city. I knew exactly what they would do. When rats realize the ship is sinking, they don't try to save the ship. They grab the cheese and run. I drove straight to my house, arriving 30 minutes before them. I set up 3 hidden nanny cameras around the living room and kitchen, all connected to a live cloud recording app on my phone. Then I sat in my car down the street and waited. Within 20 minutes, David's black SUV pulled into my driveway. He ran inside. Through the live feed on my phone, I watched my wife and my brother frantically tearing through our home. They weren't looking for legal documents. They were emptying the wall safe where I kept my grandfather's rare coin collection and the emergency cash reserves. They were screaming at each other. My wife was blaming David for being careless with the IP address. David shoved her against the kitchen counter, telling her to shut up and keep packing. He grabbed her arm violently, shaking her. The camera caught the entire interaction in perfect, high-definition clarity. It was the exact evidence of domestic instability and criminal complicity my attorney needed to strip her of parental rights forever. I dialed the police, reporting a violent home invasion in progress at my address, stating that an estranged family member was assaulting a woman inside the house. Within 6 minutes, 3 police cruisers tore down the suburban street, sirens blaring. I watched from a distance as the officers stormed through the front door. Through the window, I saw David try to fight back in his panicked state. They slammed him onto the hardwood floor, handcuffing him. My wife was dragged out in tears, covered in dust from the basement search, her hands bound behind her back. As they were being led to the cars, I pulled my vehicle up to the curb. I rolled down the window. My wife saw me, her eyes widening with a sudden, desperate hope. She begged me to tell the officers it was all a misunderstanding, that they were just trying to protect our assets. I didn't look angry. I didn't look sad. I just looked at her with the same blank, unfeeling expression she had given me at the kitchen table in my past life. I told the arresting officer that I had never seen those stolen corporate files in my house before, and that I wanted to press full charges for the theft of my property. David looked at me, the realization finally dawning in his eyes. He realized that this wasn't an accident. He realized that I had known everything. From the very beginning, the look of absolute terror on his face was the most satisfying thing I had ever experienced. By the end of the day, the FBI had executed a secondary warrant on David's firm and Marcus's software company. The entire network fell apart within 48 hours. The executive VP was arrested at the airport trying to board a flight to Cabo. My wife was held without bail due to the flight risk posed by her hidden Swiss account and secondary passport. I walked into the family court building 2 weeks later for the emergency custody hearing. I was dressed in a tailored suit, surrounded by the best legal team money could buy. My wife sat across the room in an orange jumpsuit, her hair unwashed, her spirit completely broken. The judge took less than 10 minutes to review the video evidence of the assault, the financial fraud, and the hidden assets. I was granted sole, permanent legal and physical custody of Lily. My wife was denied even supervised visitation until her criminal trial concluded. I walked out of the courthouse, into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I could breathe. I had saved my daughter, secured my wealth, and systematically dismantled the people who had destroyed me. I drove to Lily's school, waiting by the gates as the bell rang. She came running out, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, smiling brightly when she saw me. She gave me a massive hug, asking if we could go get ice cream. I smiled, buckling her into the back seat of my new car. I told her we could get whatever she wanted, that we had all the time in the world. As I put the car in drive, my phone buzzed in the console. It was an unknown number. I picked it up. A raspy, desperate voice spoke from the other end. It was David, calling from the county jail's payphone. He told me that he was facing 20 years, that his lawyers said there was no way out, and he begged me to tell him how I did it. He asked how I could have possibly known every single move they were going to make before they even made them. I paused, looking at my daughter in the rearview mirror, her innocent face completely safe from the dark world I had just navigated. I leaned into the phone and whispered that some people get what they deserve in this life, and others have to come back from the dead to give it to them. Then, I hung up the phone and threw the SIM card out the window into a storm drain. I thought everything was finally over. I had won. The past was erased, and the future was mine to write. I drove home, carried Lily inside, and put her to bed. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. I sat down at my desk to look over my shell company's financial portfolio, which was now valued at over $3 million. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had beaten the system. I had beaten fate. Then I heard a soft click at the front door. I froze. I knew both David and my wife were locked behind iron bars. The police had confirmed that Marcus and the executive VP were in federal custody. I quietly stood up, grabbing a heavy brass paperweight from my desk, and walked into the hallway. The front door slipped open. A silhouette stood in the frame, backlit by the street lamps. The person stepped into the light, removing a dark baseball cap. It was Vance, the corporate security chief. He didn't look like a security guard anymore. He looked cold, calculated, and entirely composed. He didn't have a weapon out, but he held up a small digital recorder in his hand. He pressed play. My own voice filled the empty hallway. It was the recording of the phone call I had made to David, telling him to go to my house, telling him to clear out the files, and detailing exactly how to avoid the federal tracking. Vance stopped the recording and looked at me with a faint, chilling smile. He told me that he had been tracking white-collar fraud for 20 years, and that while my brother was an amateur, I was a genius. He said he knew I had engineered the entire setup, and that the Delaware shell company holding $3 million actually belonged to me. He slid the recorder into his pocket and stepped closer. He told me he didn't care about justice, and he didn't care about my family drama. He wanted $2 million transferred to his own offshore account by midnight, or the FBI would receive this recording along with an anonymous tip linking me to the original administrative login used for the fraud. My heart dropped into my stomach. The air left my lungs. I had spent so much time focusing on the enemies I knew from my past life that I had completely underestimated the wild cards in this one. I looked at the man who held my entire freedom in his hands. I realized that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had just changed shapes. I looked at the man who held my entire freedom in his hands. I realized that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had just changed shapes. My past life taught me one thing: never back down when you have everything to lose. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat until the very last second, make sure to smash that subscribe button and drop a like. If you had a second chance at life, would you have done things differently? Let me know in the comments. See you next time.